We've talked about the freshmen, the sophomores, the juniors, and we decided which boy in each class was the best of the best. But now it is time to decide once and for all who is the best of all of NRC. Yes, dear viewers, in this compilation video, we will be going through each and every boy, ranking them on the same 3 criteria as previously discussed, because this is, in fact, a compilation. Now I know what you may be thinking. Silver, most of those videos ended in ties of some sort, so how is this video, compiling them all, not going to end in a massive tie? Well, dear viewer, I have come up with an ingenious solution, one that should hopefully bring us a definitive answer at the end of this consideration. What solution is this? Well, you'll just have to wait and see. So grab some snacks, settle in, and prepare yourself for a lot of yapping. Oh, and as always, this video will contain discussion of EN server story content, so consider this your spoiler warning. Now then, we'll be starting off our considerations with the lovable fuzzball, Grim. On the personality front, Grim is a narcissistic, gluttonous fuzzball putz that gets us into all sorts of trouble. However, his stubbornness can also be a boon. Grim single-handedly involves the MC in most of the event arcs, for better or for worse, which provides the MC and us as players a delightful time in a variety of places. Despite not being very good at very much, Grim's got the biggest ego this side of the Mississippi, and that comes with a lot of annoying quips, but a fair share of optimism too. He can be a bit annoying at times, but he has a lot of spunk and can easily shift his mood with the right motivations. At the beginning of the game, Grim comes off as a very annoying and pushy, given that he listens to no one, does only what he wants to, and doesn't really care for the consequences of his actions. Yet somehow, over time, you just come to love the little guy, even though he doesn't really grow out of these bad habits. I don't really know exactly what it is, but somehow, someway, I just started to like him, and his annoying antics just became part of him. Oh, you stole my entire lunch? Haha, classic Grim. Eating rocks off the street? Just another Tuesday for Grim. Trying to schmooze his way into some fancy tuna cans. Oh, Grimmy Grim Grim. It's a bit weird, honestly, and it might stem from the fact that Grim's a cute little cat, so he gets away with some of the more wacky things that I wouldn't tolerate if he was a human. However, it might also be in part because Grim has grown way more attached to the MC as time has gone on. He does look out for us in his own way and does stick up for us from time to time, which I think does offset some of his mischief. I think that Prologue Grim would not have cared that he bit us at the end of Book 5, and he probably would have played it off somehow with a few quips and puffed out his chest with a few compliments to himself. But Book 5 Grim is completely different. He's actually remorseful and scared of his actions, and even though the biting and clawing wasn't really him, I still think that this is some sort of MK Ultra thing. It does show some sensitivity on his part and shows us how far our relationship has come. Regardless of his growth, at his core, Grim is still a narcissistic, gluttonous fuzzball putz. But now he's our narcissistic, gluttonous fuzzball putz. And that makes him more than average, at least to me. So I'm comfortable rating his personality at a 6. As far as being a student goes, Grim is lackluster. I do think he's the bottom of the barrel compared to the other boys on this list, but I somehow feel a little guilty ranking him at half a point, so he's gonna get a full 1. Grim has this huge desire to be a great mage, and Crowley even comments on this in one of his voice lines and says that Grim has really good potential, but the problem is that Grim doesn't apply himself properly to make use of that talent. Outside of his fire magic, Grim is pretty useless, as Ace points out, and he's also looped into the Azul contract debacle because of his own laziness. Of the group, his grades improve the least based off the study guide, so I kind of wonder just how much he even put effort into studying the study guide once he had it. But regardless, on the whole, Grim just isn't a very good student, at least not in the traditional sense. So unfortunately, Grim is going to be a 1 in this category. I'm sorry, little buddy, you gotta do better. Now, for the card, Grim doesn't really have a dorm uniform card since Ramshackle is an unofficial dorm, and technically you could say that his striped ribbon card is his dorm uniform, but since that's an SR and all of the other cards that we're going to be considering are SSRs, I'm just going to rank his platinum jacket instead. This card is a balanced type with decent overall stats, and the spells are fairly balanced as well. We've got a Cosmic first, Fire second, and an unlockable Cosmic. So based on the elements alone, there is a bit of versatility here, but not all that much. However, the first Cosmic spell comes with healing, and depending on the level, nullifies Curse to either the caster or allies. That is very, very useful, and it can work in a variety of battle situations. Plus, the unlockable third spell has another buff that nullifies Blind to either the caster or allies, again depending on level, while also boosting cosmic damage of allies post level 5. Given that the duo partner for this card is Malleus, and Malleus's dorm card is Cosmic with critical chance, you could build yourself a heavy-hitting team pretty easily combining these two. To me, this sounds like a very useful card overall, and even though the buffs and debuffs are on the cosmic spells, which are neutral on the elemental table, it doesn't really feel like it's that much of a drawback, considering how you would have to build the team to get the most bang for your buck. I think if you worked towards the card's strengths with the rest of the team, you could conquer many a battle. So for that reason, I'll be giving it an 8. This means that Grim gets a total of 15 points. Not bad for a start. Next up, we have Ace, and boy, howdy, do I not like him. I don't know what it is, but Ace has consistently been on my bad side since the beginning of the game. Perhaps it's his cocky attitude and quick quips that I just don't vibe with. And from a story perspective, Ace is a fantastic character, and he provides a lot of comic relief when put alongside Deuce and Grim. However, on his own, Ace is a slacker who only really bothers with things that are fun or schemes that he believes will get him a leg up on something. More often than not, his own lackadaisical attitude is what undoes his plotting, and even if it doesn't, he isn't exactly the stealthiest person. This can lead to some very fun interactions, however, it also paints Ace in a less favorable light. He's got a similar attitude problem as Grim, but he doesn't have any of the cute fluff to go along with it. Sure, over time he warms up to us, Deuce, and the other freshmen, but Ace is still Ace, and at this point in the story, we haven't really seen him grow very much as a person, at least compared to some of the other freshmen. However, Ace does have situational and social awareness, so there are times where he shines in a more positive light. Ace can be seen smooth-talking his way out of things quite well on multiple occasions. In fact, we would never have been able to gain entry to the Atlantica Memorial Museum in Book 3 had Ace not distracted the guard with his platitudes. In Stitch's Tropical Turbulence, he offers us a subtle hint to not eat Lilia's mystery fruit, and he turns his attitude right around when Floyd mentions cooking a wonderful dinner. In Playful Land, he uses his brain to take care of the puppet problem in the finale, which was a brilliant moment. Ace also has a lot of moments where he gives clarity to other characters by speaking frankly. He does this to Riddle in Book 1, which effectively becomes the catalyst for Riddle's overblot. He speaks plainly to the Ghost Bride in her event about relationships. He's a bit frank with Azul in Book 3 about the contracts, has his various moments in the second Fairy Gala, and at the end of the day, Ace is honestly much more complex than my initial impression of him granted him. And considering these factors, I bumped his personality rating up to a 6. Academically, though, Ace is not the best student out there. It's not that he couldn't be, It's that he doesn't try, and he's not at least as egregious as Grim, but still, it's not great. Ace is entirely motivated to get out of things and will come up with schemes to do so. However, if he put a little bit of that motivation and effort into actually doing the things he was supposed to do, he'd probably be much better off academically and could still do all of the fun things that he does. I'm not sure that Ace has had a truly strong desire to do much of anything aside from maybe sleight of hand magic, which is something that takes a lot of practice to do effectively, and we can see that he does it very effectively, which means that Ace can do things. In fact, he can do very difficult things very well. He just doesn't care for the academics enough to actually do them. We can see him sneaking out of orientation to look for all the spots his brother recommended he slack off him, which to me feels like this laziness might be inherited a little bit. But this is an example of the lengths that Ace will go to not have to do something that he's supposed to be doing. He's totally okay skipping out on school for Playful Land as well, which would be fine, honestly, because one day out of school is not the highest crime, though Riddle would disagree. But it does become a problem with Ace's overall grades. Part of the problem with Azul study guides was that the market was overfilled, sure, but unless these exams were weighted heavily towards the final grades, there was no way that 1A would be making up for consistent C's and D's. I have to imagine, given the context that this exam particularly was weighted, but even still, Ace having to rely on this singular test to bail him out speaks to his shortcomings. If he was not in Heartslable, I have a feeling he might be in true danger of failing, so for studiousness, Ace is getting a 3. From a card perspective, Ace is decent. His dorm uniform is an attack-type fire flora with an unlockable water spell. From an elemental perspective, this card is well-rounded, and once the third spell is unlocked, it can go pretty much anywhere, and if used effectively, can also deal some decent damage. In theory, the fire spell should be used first to give Ace a power boost, then his second spell should be used with Duo to maximize the punch, although not all situations work out that perfectly. The third spell also has an HP regen ability that will trigger for 3 rounds, which is one of my favorite abilities in the game. It's very exciting, but it is locked behind that uncap requirement and reaching spell level 5, so it can be a little tricky to get it. The stats for the card are a little low, but I do think that the damage boosts on the first spell and eventual utility of the third make up for that. Ace's card is not as effective as some of the others in this vein, so I'm going to give it a solid 7. However, I do think this card is the best all-arounder from the tutorial gacha, since it gives you the most utility out of the available cards despite not being as powerful as Riddle or Leona. Anyways, with all of that said, Ace is sitting nicely with 16 points. Go Ace! Next up is Deuce, who I think is a fantastic young lad who has had a lot of growth both on and off the screen. Deuce is the most serious person in the MC's initial friend group, which makes him the anchor of that group through the main story's progression, at least in the sense that he keeps folks on task. He's not doing so because he genuinely wants to, it's a bit more coincidental. However, he is a great counterbalance to the chaos of Ace and Grim, and he's well suited for this task. While Deuce was once the most famous delinquent in Clocktown, he's resolved to change his ways and become an honor student now that he's at NRC. While this attitude shift happened off-screen, it is something that Deuce is open about, and it's the main motivation for all of his other actions. There are times when he slips back into his old ways, but Deuce is usually quick to correct himself, as we can see in his dorm uniform vignette, his star-sending robes vignette, and other moments throughout the main story. He is earnest in a way that feels more innocent and honest than some of the other characters, and I think this makes him way more endearing overall. Sure, Grim and Ace warm up to us eventually, but Deuce has always been, at least in my memory, pretty chill overall. It doesn't take very long for him to open up to us about his past, And I think the fact that he didn't know cooking eggs were unfertilized felt way more like innocence rather than ignorance, particularly with the genuine care he felt towards the perceived sacrifice of the baby chicks. In fact, Deuce's dedication to his family is something that I really admire, and it kind of adds to this overall air that he has. He really loves his mom, even if the two don't always see eye to eye, and a lot of his actions are taken with consideration for his family. In the prologue, Deuce is super concerned about being expelled because it would hurt his mom. During Sam's New Year's sale, he pulls on his shopping experiences with his mom to enhance the shopping experience at the sale. In his Star Sending Robes vignette, we get more detail on his past delinquent days, which also includes his mom and grandma. And I'm sure his birthday cards, none of which I have, also talk about his mom in some way. Even during White Rabbit Fest, we can see that he and his mom aren't entirely on the same page, but they're still getting along, and Deuce is doing his best to make her proud. Deuce really is trying to be the best son that he can to give back a little of what his mom gave him, and it doesn't come off in a codependent way. It really feels like genuine care, and I think that that's a very beautiful thing. On a less serious note, Deuce's reliance on his cauldron is also a very fun time, and while it is designed to be a gag, this gives me the same vibe as Kalim constantly wanting to party to solve every conflict, which is also technically a gag, but boy is it fun. For some reason, the cauldron also seems to lack the true malice of a villain or the intent to actually harm whenever Deuce uses it. It just seems like Deuce is using it as the piece that ends the conflict, but isn't fully aware of the actual consequences of summoning the cauldron, like in Book 5 when he makes a lovely hole in Ramshackle's floor. Anyways, Deuce is one of my favorite freshmen, and his personality is delightful even if he's a bit more serious, so I'm giving him a 9. On the studiousness end, Deuce is not a good student, but it's not for a lack of trying. Since he spent most of his middle school days hanging out with the wrong crowd, he wasn't attending classes regularly, so he didn't get the same background that everyone else has academically. Even when he was in school, the subject matter never really clicked with him, as he admits in Book 5, so it's likely that even if he had stayed in school, he may not be in a much better position than he is now. However, because there is a gap in his resume, Deuce is playing catch-up, which is affecting his overall grades. It's really not just straight-A students who are studious, and Deuce is really trying his darndest to actually get good grades, and he studies a fair bit. I think this determination is way more important, especially compared to our previous two contenders' attitudes towards studying. Ace even mocks Deuce over math problems and panics a little bit when Riddle appears, goading Deuce some more about his lack of knowledge. But Riddle recognizes Deuce's sincere efforts and helps him out without any reprimand, an experience I'm sure Ace is not familiar with. Plus, Deuce's motivations for getting good grades is way more sincere, since his desire to be an honor student primarily stems from making his mother proud. He never wants to see her cry over him again, so his resolve in this matter is firm, even if his efforts have yet to bear any fruit. Because he's so sincere and he's trying so hard, I'm giving Deuce an 8 here. As far as his dorm card goes, though, it's a bit lackluster. I feel like defense cards on the whole can feel a bit less impressive, since their use case can be more situational, depending on their abilities, of course, and in Deuce's case, I don't see his dorm card as being particularly useful. This is a defense-type Cosmic Water card, which does leave open possibilities, but the third spell is also water and doesn't have the best abilities ever either. The Cosmic and Second Water spells have damage boosts for the caster, which aid Deuce's low power. However, they only help for one turn, so they can only ever help those specific spells. And since Deuce is not an attack-type card, I don't really know that the damage boosts are that great overall. The water spell also has a power drain on foes for that turn, which can be useful, But on the whole, there are defense cards out there with better utility. That said, the HP stat is absolutely massive. So this is a very, very tanky boy that you can use to bolster the HP of an attack-focused team really easily just by including Deuce on it. All in all, I'm going to give this card a 6. It's got some mojo and a bit of versatility, but not so much as to rank it higher. This leaves Deuce with a total score of 23. Not bad at all. Trey, the most average of Joes with the wackiest hat this side of the Mississippi. Trey keeps a low profile on purpose, but unlike some other folks, it has nothing to do with subterfuge or shady business dealings. Instead, Trey tries to blend in with the crowd because he's uncomfortable with receiving attention, and that informs a lot of his decisions and actions. One of his vignettes is even titled "Normal is What I Am," while another is titled "Nailing That Bare Minimum." So I think summing up Trey as a normal guy is a pretty normal thing to do. In fact, he's so average in every aspect, it's almost shocking that he has special talents and interests in baking and dental care respectively. But honestly, it'd be super boring if he didn't have any quirks, and these two create some fantastic moments. Trey is the son of bakers, and in that position, you're bound to learn a thing or two, and boy, howdy, did Trey learn. It doesn't really matter what kind of sweet it is, Trey can make it and do so phenomenally. Even his Soom is adept in the kitchen when it comes to these pursuits, so you know it's gotta be near and dear to his heart. You know what else is? Dental care. This guy will not let you escape if you don't brush your teeth, and no excuse you can give will be good enough. Because he's got the largest stockpile of tooth cleaning implements and accoutrements on campus, or at least that's my assumption, based on the fact that he immediately offered spare toothbrushes to Ace and Deuce in his school uniform vignette. Also, given that his Soom literally jumped some of the Hartzell students who were going to skimp out on toothbrushing after eating their tart, and regular Trey just let it happen, I think shows just how serious Trey is about this. Which brings up a really good point, I think, about his character. While Trey doesn't like to be praised, he's not going to belittle his talents in order to ensure that he conforms. Instead, he's going to adapt things he isn't passionate about to suit this goal, while still retaining his talents. Plus, given how much he cares about everyone's teeth, you know that he probably also truly cares about their well-being. Couple this with his soft approach to handling Riddle and gentle overall nature, it's no wonder that folks compare him to an older brother. Though I think it's important to note that even though Trey is gentle, he's not a pushover, and we can see this demonstrated in his dorm uniform vignette. He lets the freshmen fail to create a cake after they've made their ridiculous demands of him, and once they have learned their lesson, they still have to deal with the consequences, because Trey's not going to bail them out completely. Sure, he made a new cake to save the party, but the freshmen can't partake in it until their mess of a cake has been eaten. A nice firm boundary that can come across as a dastardly action because Trey, of course, knew from the start that this endeavor would fail. But honestly, some people only learn if they make the mistakes themselves, so I don't really fault him too much here. Anyways, with all that said, I'm going to give him a 7 since it's a bit above average, but not exactly a stellar grade, which I think he would appreciate. Now, when it comes to studies, I think Trey aims to be just average so as to not draw attention to himself. However, I do think there are certain subjects where he excels despite his effort not to. Even if that is not the case for some reason, at the very least, there is absolutely no way that he's going to be allowed to retain his position as Vice House Warden of Hartzell with bad grades. I just can't envision Riddle favoring nepotism over academics, especially now as a sophomore since his rule as House Warden is more cemented. So, because Trey is still his Vice House Warden, I just can't imagine Trey doing poorly academically. Plus, Trey is also a part of the science club, and science, I think, is generally regarded as a harder subject. So if he's able to excel in that club and create fantastic strawberries as a result of his experimenting, he's likely smart enough to do well academically in other subjects too. So I'm going to give him another 7 here, which is another ranking I'm sure he would appreciate. From a card perspective, Trey's pretty chill. He's got a water, flora, and eventual cosmic defense type card with some nice utility and decent stats. At max level, the first spell provides modest HP restoration, and the third nullifies curse to allies while also boosting the caster. Overall, this is a decent defense type card that has the flexibility with its third spell to go to more situations since it's not too elementally locked. The HP restoration can be really nice, and if the third spell is unlocked, pairing this card with other healers can ensure that you're able to heal since you can nullify curses placed on those other healing cards. I've used Trey's dorm uniform for healing many times, and it's pretty reliable. The chunky HP stat also allows this card to balance out a team of attackers by bolstering the overall HP pool, and at the end of the day, it's honestly quite a solid pick, particularly for Heartstable enjoyers, so I'm going to give it another 7. So, Trey ends up with the nice tidy sum of 21 points. Moving on, we now have Cater. So Cater Diamond is a sunshiny, aspiring social media influencer who's very fun overall. He's got a bright demeanor, generically positive attitude in most situations, and is our OG in-universe shipper, so he definitely gets points for that. But don't let this happy-go-lucky mask deceive you, because underneath it, Cater has some complicated feelings that he doesn't like to show to anyone. This, I think, serves him well from a character standpoint because it gives him a bit of nuance, which in turn gives him depth, particularly by comparison. Kalim may be oblivious sunshine, but Cater is sunshine with an edge, and this distinction between Cater and some of the other positive characters truly helps him stand out. We get a few examples of this melancholy being teased out of him, like in his ceremonial robes vignette, where this forlorn gaze speaks volumes without having to be explicitly talked about, and in his labware vignette, where we have some of his mandrakes reflecting his more depressed side. Cater is very good at hiding these feelings from others, or at least he thinks he is, because we can see Trey struggling a little bit at times with Cater's lack of trust in him to talk about these things despite their friendship. But I think on the whole, if you don't really know him, you probably wouldn't pick up on these feelings either. But none of this is to say that Cater is miserable, though. In fact, he seems to be far from it, and he doesn't really let the whispers and gossip about him get him down, like we can see in his dorm uniform vignette, where he also single-handedly saved a good chunk of Heartstable from a beheading because of his magic hand snapping. He can be cheery, bright, socially adept, and a bit of a smooth talker when he wants to be. All qualities that any extrovert worth their salt would have, or so I'm told. Cater can also be insightful and offer advice or solutions to problems that the brain cell boys are facing, and he's also pretty smart overall, seeing how he tricked us into painting roses during book 1 like he was Tom Sawyer or something. In a lot of other situations too, Cater's social butterfly tendencies and overall awareness of trends come in very handy. During the Terror is Trending Halloween event, he gives us some thoughtful insight on the Magicam monsters storming the school. In his Playful Land vignette, he's able to convince Jack to search for hidden foxes with him, and he even gets Jack excited about the activity during their interactions. And the guy is one of the very few people on campus who's not afraid to straight up approach Malleus, although his intentions are a little less than pure, but still. Cater has a lot of positive things going for him, and overall he's a very fun guy, so I'm going to give him an 8 here. On the studies front, though, Cater is not doing so hot. We get several examples of him slacking off in various ways. However, I do suppose I have to give him credit for reaching his junior year, because that means he's not failed out of school the previous 2 years, so his grades can't be that bad, right? But in his PE uniform vignette, we can see him skirting the rules and using his special magic to avoid actually running and completing the activity, which is totally a mood, but also not technically allowed and also technically slacking off. In Riddle's dorm uniform vignette, we can see Cater's addiction to Magicam interfering with his studies and his overall lack of care for this particular exam. Cater certainly isn't a sit down and memorize a book kind of guy, and that's entirely valid when it comes to academics because I, too, am not that kind of person. However, there seems to be a bit of helplessness when it comes to Cater that impacts his grade. I don't think it's necessarily a refusal to study, but it might be more akin to what Deuce describes in Book 5 when he's talking to Epel, where it's frustrating to the point where one might not try to fix it rather than finding an alternative because of the situation and system that they're in. We can see that Cater can do well in studying when the format makes sense to him because Riddle is able to successfully relay the information for that particular test through Magicam, and it clicks with Cater during Riddle's dorm uniform vignette. But I'm not sure that Cater is continuing to make use of similar methods for his other classes and overall studies. It's a bit unfortunate, but as it stands, I've got to give him a 5 here because he has done well enough to survive for this long, but we don't get a lot of evidence in his favor when grades are concerned, so middle of the road it is. Now, Cater's card is a bit better, as it is a Flora, Fire, and eventual Cosmic Balance type card. The stats, therefore, are more balanced than the other card types, and the spells offer a bit more utility too. At max rank, the Flora spell will do strong damage and majorly cut foes' power that turn, while the unlockable Cosmic spell boosts the power of the caster and cuts foes' power during that turn. Because the elemental types of this card are almost rounded out, similar to Trey's, this card can also go in a variety of use cases, which makes it a bit more versatile than some of the other cards. Plus, if used alongside Trey's dorm uniform, you can cover the elemental gambit for an omni battle while also having access to both duos. I personally think this is a fun card, and in general, I prefer using balanced cards since they usually have a bit more utility without fully compromising the stats. And this card is really no different. In the right circumstances, I think it can be very useful, and if you're building your teams around Heart's-level characters, it's a solid pickup. Therefore, I'm going to rate it a 7 here. This means that Cater is receiving a total of 20 points. Next up is Riddle. I had a hard time pinning down Riddle's personality in the House Warden video because he just made a lot of sense to me, and that made it hard for me to articulate my points about him. This is still very true, but I think I've gotten a much better argument this time around for my scoring. First and foremost, Riddle is serious, very much so, and while a lot of his nature was crafted by his mother's influence, I do think that Riddle enjoys being serious and forthright. He's actually quite honest, almost to a fault, but this tends to get overshadowed by his focus on the rules and rule following. Riddle holds himself to a high standard, and in doing so, he's not going to let himself slip at all. The rules are just an extension of that, or at least they're the rationale which spawned this tendency, so Riddle's not going to be lying per se without an extremely good reason. While he sometimes places this expectation onto others, he's also not completely unaware either, and can recognize when folks are making a legitimate effort and when they're just coasting on by. But because he's so closely tied to his convictions and is stubborn, it can be impossible to reason with him sometimes. This can lead to the less than ideal situations that we sometimes see him in, but I think without his underlying dedication and earnest nature, he'd be a very entitled and rash individual who I probably wouldn't like as much. He's also got a soft side like we can see with the hedgehogs in Ace's vignette, and he does truly care about those around him like we see in Deuce's dorm uniform vignette. Heck, even Riddle's own vignette story is centered around him helping his dormmates and adapting his approach to doing so in order to best serve them. Riddle is in no way unreasonable, at least post book 1. He's just very stubborn, and because he's both earnest and stubborn, his attempts to help can come off as being very overbearing if not communicated properly. And given that sometimes Riddle busts a blood vessel during this process, I can see how easily his genuine care can be misconstrued by others. Of course, during book 1, he comes off as entitled, however, that's rectified very quickly, and then post book 1, Riddle is much more reasonable, despite his lingering flaws. Honestly, given the dorm that he's in and those in it, having this strictness is almost a necessary trait, and I do think it serves him well overall, given his other pursuits. I think that during my initial review of Riddle's character, I was unnecessarily harsh, but after coming back to rewrite this section, I'm much more comfortable rating him at an 8. He's not perfect in my eyes, but he's definitely better than some of his fellows, and I think that counts for something. When it comes to book smarts, Riddle's getting 100s on everything, so he's getting a 10 out of 10 here. I don't think I could come up with a rationale to give him any less because this guy is dedicated to his studies and is constantly on the lookout for more information. He's the sole reason that a particular test didn't get a curve because he had discovered a brand new research paper and then incorporated it into his test answers. Riddle does not play around with academics. In fact, he's also the sole reason certain members of his dorm are not failing out of school. For a sophomore to be tutoring a junior means that that sophomore must already have an understanding of that higher level material. So Riddle's basically set when it comes to this. Not only that, but he actively works hard towards his academic goals, as all of his smarts and power was hard-won over years and years of prep work and dedication. I'm not sure there's another person in the whole school that can rival him here. Well, perhaps there's at least one, but we'll talk about that later. For now, though, Riddle is getting a 10. In terms of card utility, though, Riddle is a bit mid. His dorm uniform is a very strong all-fire, all-damage attack type card, and if you're going into a Flora battle, he's going to smoke the competition. Unfortunately, in other contexts, he's not so useful because this card is solely focused on damage and has only one element. There's no real utility because it's just meant to burn everything to the ground, so you're not really going to be using it for anything other than that. When I first started the game, this is one of the cards that I really wanted, but now that I have it, I don't use it often, even though it is my second most powerful card in my library. It's just so locked into its use case, and I think that's its greatest flaw. But because it's so powerful in that case, I can't detract too many points from it, so Riddle's card is going to get a 5 here. This means that Riddle's total score in the sophomore pool is a 23, which is not only much better than last time, but also well-deserved. Moving into Savannah Claw, we have Jack, who is the shining paragon of justice at NRC. This tsundere is such a lovely fellow, honestly. He's really a big softie at heart that's just a little bit competitive. Jack has a unique sense of justice that's based on his moral compass, which some might argue is still a little skewed, but it is still better than 90% of the other folks on campus who don't even know what morals are. But because Jack has morals, he also has standards for how he should act as well as how he should be treated, and he upholds these standards in all that he does. We get many examples of his morals coming into play, such as in Book 2, where his conscience bothers him enough to betray Leona's plot, also in his Labware vignette, where he repays Jade for trashing his mushrooms by working at the lounge, and in his dorm uniform vignette, where he takes issue with the Savannah Claw upperclassmen for not playing Spell Drive fairly. Most of Jack's focus is on getting stronger, so he has very strict rules both on and off the field, with his moral compass skewed to fit this focus. On the field, he wants to uphold all of the rules so that his victory is a true one, where he was able to completely defeat his foe under the same conditions, making him the undeniable champion. Off of the field, he is pretty similar and sticks to activities which allow him to flex his muscles in other ways, or provides an experience to further his training. Jack can be stubborn in this area, like we see in Bean's Day, where, in his Bean's camo vignette, he purposefully provokes Floyd in order to fight him fair and square against Azul's wishes. Jack doesn't want this experience to be wasted one iota, so he does what he has to, or at least what he thinks he has to, even if it doesn't offer the highest chances of success, just so that he can test himself. While this may seem like a foolhardy errand, and it is, it does show how determined Jack is to not only get what he wants, but yet again to stick with his moral code. Jack isn't one to shirk his duties, whether it's during Bean's day or the day-to-day of the dorm. In his dorm uniform vignette, he doesn't give up on helping Ruggie and even goes to great lengths to save Ruggie from a scolding. On the whole, Jack is an upstanding guy who just puts up a cold exterior. He's one of my favorites in this grouping because of his outlasting dedication to his morals and fellows, and I find his tsundere attitude very fun. He's not going to let you know that he wants to help you, but his tail absolutely will, and it's very endearing, so he's getting a 9 here. As far as studies go, we don't actually get a lot of info where Jack is concerned in my memory. We know for certain that he doesn't take a deal with Azul, although how much of this was his fair fighting attitude versus not needing it is kind of up for debate. But given how determined Jack is to test himself in every situation he's in, I can't imagine he'd be shirking his academic duties. It wouldn't be good from his moral standpoint anyways, since it's what he's here to do. And if he were to fail out of school, he wouldn't be able to challenge half of the people that he wants to. In fact, if he were to fail, he'd never get the chance to go toe-to-toe with Leona, which would be disastrous for him, so I can't imagine he's doing terribly from a study standpoint. Jack also seems like he'd be doing good with some of the non-book activities at the school. He's growing a little cactus, making friends in other dorms, and just seems to be doing well overall. In fact, during his interaction with the other dorms, we can see Jack be really smart. He's able to piece together that Azul is an octopus merman from Leona's nickname. He does a lot of negotiating on our behalf with Azul during the contract composition process, and during that process he asks a lot of good questions. And even afterwards, he's able to guess what Floyd's special magic does when they're fighting. All of that, coupled with his beastman senses, make him a very observant and formidable fellow who I just can't see having any issues academically, so I'm going to give him an 8 here. Now, Jack's card is an attack type with decent stats, but less spell elemental versatility since it has fire, flora, and an eventual flora spells. Also, the spell abilities aren't that impressive considering the other contenders we've had so far. The first is a power boost to the caster for that turn, and the third is a power drain on your foes for that turn. While these buffs are very powerful, the third spell is somewhat situational and doesn't really offer any further play styles. Jack will be limited to either flora or water use cases, and while I can see his third spell making him super useful in water exams, I just don't feel like he's nearly as strong compared to the other attack type cards in this list, so I'm giving him a 5. Which means in total, Jack is receiving 22 points. Next up, we have Ruggie Bucci, and while it is very easy to meme on Ruggie for just being a broke little guy, that's not the end-all be-all of his character. In fact, he's got quite a lot going for him and is much more resilient than I think he gets credit for, at least at first glance, because he comes off as so laid back. Nothing seems to bother Ruggie, and he'd much rather go with the flow than stand against the tide. It's much easier to make connections that way or score a part-time gig, and Ruggie is very partial to hustling. While he's not going to waste his time cozying up to someone who isn't going to benefit him in the long run, he's still an agreeable guy who doesn't make trouble if he can help it. While he's not as calculated as some other folks, he does have a great work ethic and oftentimes is genuine with others, which I think sets him apart from the other students. Ruggie had a bit of a rough and tumble upbringing which steered him in this direction, but I don't think he'd be as motivated as he is or as resourceful as he is without those experiences. Even though he's out for himself 99.9% of the time, He can also be considerate and does have his own sort of moral code, which we can see when he brings home all those nearly expired food items to share with the neighborhood kids at the beginning of book 4. Ruggie's not heartless or ruthless, but he's also not above getting his hands dirty and won't let an opportunity pass by him if he can help it. He's less mindless scavenger and more motivated hustler, which I respect. Ruggie's just a hardworking blue-collar guy who's going to make sure he gets his due, and maybe a bit more. So for the personality section, I'm giving him a solid 8. As far as studiousness goes, Ruggie's not failing. I can't remember a time in the main story or any of the vignettes I have where his grades get discussed specifically. And like most other characters where this is the case, I've just assumed that they're doing well enough that mentioning that they're doing well would be a moot point. This guy's got a great work ethic, so he should be able to work towards his academic goals well too. Given how prestigious NRC is, and therefore how expensive it must be, there's no way that Ruggie is flunking out and messing up this opportunity. At least that was my assumption, since I don't have too much in the ways of supplemental stories, but I did do a bit of digging and my suspicions were confirmed. In Ruggie's birthday boy vignette, he talks about how he really didn't have a good academic background prior to coming to NRC, but with the help of Leona, he's now achieving middling grades. So technically speaking, Ruggie should be middle of the road given those grades. However, I think his drive and determination to make sure he was getting everything he could from his school days, from the part-time gig connections to actual academic support, he should be ranking a little higher. I also agree with Ruggie that his efforts are really impressive, and I think he has every right to be proud of what he's accomplished so far. So for this category, Ruggie is getting a solid 8. In the card department, Ruggie is getting a 0. I hate this card. It always ruins my pity. I cannot get Ruggie to stop showing up during the 50-50, and because it is specifically Mr. Broke Ruggie himself, I am especially upset at the audacity. Jokes aside, this is a very decent defense type Cosmic Water card with an eventual fire spell. It's also another defense card with damage cuts, which means it's not going to be an especially heavy hitter, but it will boost your attack team's HP a good deal. Because this card has 3 different spell elements, it's way more versatile than Riddle's, and provides a few more use cases than some of the other Dorm cards with similar cosmic limitations. Plus, the unlockable third spell comes with a boost to evasion, which isn't something I've seen on a card in these considerations before, at least that I can remember. It not only fits Ruggie's character, but it can negate some damage, which could be really nice in defense exams or survival battles. I don't personally use this card much since its buddies are mainly Savannah Claw and my teams are entirely based around Bean's Camo Floyd, but it's still a nice situational card with decent enough utility, so I'm going to give it a 7. This brings Ruggie up to the grand total of 22 points. Good job. Alrighty, up next is Leona King Scholar, the oldest kiddo of the human grouping and the king of Savannah Claw. This guy is one lazy lion who's gotta either really see the value in what he's doing, or it's going to be like pulling teeth to get him to do it. The reason for his laziness is likely tied to his past and his self-worth, as he was constantly put down despite doing well simply because he was second born, which I can absolutely see evolving into him not trying ever because it'll never be good enough to impress those who he desires validation from, or at least that has become his perception. Because of this, Leona is often found sleeping the day away in a variety of places, which also means he's skipping classes a ton. This has in part led to him being held back a few grades, which is why he's 20 while everyone else is a bit younger, but that does not by any means indicate his intelligence. In fact, Leona is wicked smart, plays chess regularly, and is able to come up with schemes on the fly. Since he has nothing to prove to anyone either, Leona's not necessarily worried about getting his hands dirty if he needs to, and he's willing to bend the rules to suit him or his goals if he can. Consistently skirting around these rules requires tact and skill, which Leona has in spades. The other thing he's got going for him is his charismatic leadership abilities, which we can see on display during Book 2, Book 3, and various vignettes like his dorm uniform. He's not going to waste his time going after small fries, but he's also not going to let problems get out of hand to the point where they disturb him. And if you're able to earn his respect, you'll be respected too. But if you're making a fool of yourself and aren't as talented at all, he's not going to give you the time of day. This goes for everyone, regardless of status, with the only true exceptions being his brother Felina and Malleus. However, overall, I think this is a very positive quality for him to have. And if you happen to trigger his competitive side, the lazy line will disappear and you'll be met with the fiercest of opponents. The more of Leona we've gotten to see, the more he's kind of grown on me as a character, and while I feel he is a bit immature in his avoidance, he's got enough nuance to him to make him solid, and I have a lot of hope for his future. He's starting to grow a little bit here and there, and I think if he gave himself more love and more space to grow, he'd become a truly influential individual. But as it stands, he's not quite there, so he's not going to get a perfect score. Instead, he's going to receive an 8. When it comes to book smarts, Leona has them in spades. However, he doesn't apply himself to any of these academic pursuits, or at least that was the case in years past, because for all intents and purposes, Leona should have graduated long ago. He's been held back a few times, and while it was through his fault and his fault alone, that doesn't make him dumb, he's just lazy, like we talked about before. At the beginning of Book 7, we find out that Leona even qualifies for some of the most restrictive internships due to his grades being so good, which is wild considering how much he skips class, but regardless, he's doing fantastically academically. He's able to whip up a potion in a few minutes that took Epel, Rook, and Grim hours to make. He's got super strong unique magic, he tutors Ruggie and is somewhat responsible for Ruggie's grades improving, and he's just smart in general with his chess and his scheming. Technically speaking, Leona should rank high in this category because he is so wickedly smart, and he does get good grades. But he also skips class all the time and got held back a bunch, which doesn't really make him a good student. I'm rather conflicted here, but I think because Leona's so reluctant to apply himself and put in the effort, regardless of the reason or the end result of his grades, I'm going to give him a 5.5 here. Just because he can doesn't mean that he does, and I don't think ranking him particularly high here would be fair considering folks like Riddle and Azul who are not only smart, but also are applying themselves to all that they do with such vigor. So, for Leona, it's a 5.5. From a card perspective, Leona's got a Flora, and eventual Flora attack type card that's really, really good in its specific use case. But that use case is niche, so this card's use is also limited. The card has no utility on the first 2 spells. They just kind of hit things hard. Only on the 3rd spell does this card have an additional effect of power drain on foes. So until you unlock that ability, you're limited to only dishing out damage, which isn't necessarily a problem given the intended use of this card, but it is still a bit disappointing considering a lot of the other dorm cards can also hit fairly well while providing additional effects. This was my very first SSR, so it does have a special place in my heart, but it's not the best overall card given how limited its use cases and abilities are. But again, when you use it in its intended context for its intended purpose, you'll be smoking the competition. So I'm still going to give this card a 5, which is a little mid because of the overall utility. That means that Leona is going to receive 18.5 total points. Wow. Now then, moving into Octavanel, we'll be starting with yet another House Warden, Azul Grotto. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. I find Azul to be such a delightful little capitalist being who also happens to be a deal maker, which is a fantastic combo. However, his schmoozery doesn't come with the same kind of polish as an Ernesto or similarly shady characters. In fact, it's pretty easy to see right through Azul's actions to glean his intentions, and it's honestly kind of refreshing and endearing. Funnily enough, even though I dunk on Leona's motivations in Book 2, I actually found the plot of Book 3 to be the most juvenile, and I think it's because Azul came off as so obviously fake in his dealings. This isn't a demerit as far as I'm concerned, it's actually, again, like I said, very refreshing. And what he lacks in true charisma, he makes up for with meticulous planning. Part of the reason I enjoy Azul so much as a character is because of his determination and his drive. Does he have the purest of motivations? No. In fact, he's powered almost exclusively by spite. However, what he's been able to accomplish with that spite is nothing to scoff at. Contracts or not, Azul is a formidable force with the energy to do whatever it takes to ensure his goals are accomplished, and he doesn't really care what happens to those who get in his way. However, he's very careful about who he does and doesn't cross, and when, which shows that he is not only calculating but intelligent. The boy is constantly weighing odds, solving mental equations, and perfecting each and every step he takes so that no one can challenge him. Of course, there are times where he fails, but even when that happens, it just adds more fuel to his fire and spurns him onwards towards more growth. His attitude is rather admirable, and his interactions with other characters can be really fun. Plus, he usually is able to piece together plots and puzzles better than most of the rest of the main cast, which is nice to see, especially in events. Although I will say it can be a bit bland to have all of his everything be about business 99.9% of the time, and to have the majority of Azul's interactions with other characters be only about business. And this can lead to some funny moments, sure, like in Glorious Masquerade, where he has Ruggie and Jamil verbally agree that they chose to be left behind under no duress and would not later seek recompense for the experience. But I do wish there was just a little bit more of the other pieces of Azul shown in some of those other events. But overall, he's delightful, so I'm giving him an 8. Given that Azul puts in the work in other aspects of his life, there is no way that his grades are slipping. So, the only place I can even think that Azul doesn't excel in is PE. But can you really blame a fish for being unable to fly? Well, only if they're a flying fish, which Azul is not, so we can give him a pass. True to his business-minded self, Azul is making sure he's getting on all the teacher's good sides through any means necessary, including studying. When we first encounter him in Book 3, many of his prolific talents in each of the subjects that we observe him in are, in part, obtained through contracts. However, the main plot point of that book is the study guide, which Azul 100% put all of his own effort into. Not only did he put in the work to analyze hundreds of years of test results, he also made sure to frame the whole ordeal in a way that made it impossible to challenge so his true goals could be achieved. It was a well-conceived and cunning plan that worked brilliantly until us meddling kids and our talking cat got involved. But for this consideration, I think it speaks volumes to the lengths that Azul will go to succeed in academics as well as everything else. This isn't an attitude unique to his NRC self either, as we can see in his overblock flashbacks that Azul resolved to study at a very young age, and this is actually what developed his special magic. And we can even see him working 8 times as hard as his peers in that pursuit. Being an octopus certainly helps, but as they are generally bright critters to begin with, but Azul exceeds those expectations and then some, so I'm also going to be giving him a 10 here. For his card, Azul is a defense type, exclusively water card, which does make him situational in the same way as Riddle. At this point, I think most of us are aware of the points of contention regarding single element cards, and while they really shine in their use cases, they don't have a lot of variance in their playstyles. But Azul's got one up on those other ones since his unique attribute is healing. Plus, the unlockable third spell has a curse nullifier for Azul or allies depending on level, which is very useful in cases where you'd likely be using the card. Since Azul's Dorm card is focused on defense and has healing, more often than not, you're not going to include it for the duo, you're including it to heal. So having that extra curse nullification can be a game changer in those types of battles, especially when you're using more than one healer. So the more that I thought about this card since my last review, the more useful it became to me. So I'm going to give it an extra point here, bumping it up to a 7. I can't rank it any higher than this because of the single element limitations, but the utility is still great and it is a solid card. all in all, Azul is going to go home with 25 this time around, which is another glow up. Congratulations. So, Jade. Jade is spooky in the most subtle way possible, which makes him even spookier than a normal spooky dude. At least with Rook, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, but with Jade, you'll be caught in his net long before you even realize it exists, and that's in part due to his subdued and gentle past. From what we can see, Jade is calm, collected, and thoughtful. He's exceptionally suited for the service industry and has no trouble taking on the role of a butler or a manager or whatever you need him to do. Need him to obtain that exclusive shoe? Done. Need him to post a Magicam for you? He's already done it. Need information on all the incoming students in your dorm, including their secret social media accounts, dirty secrets, family ties, and any other sort of information that you could possibly obtain? Jade's got your back. He's a subtle threat, one that works in the shadows, and one who, for all intents and purposes, seems like your average Joe who's just bitten off more than he can chew with Azul and Floyd. In fact, if Floyd wasn't around, I'm not sure folks would trust Jade as much as they do, since having someone to compare him to makes Jade seem even more trustworthy, because, Floyd might steal your textbook on a whim, but Jade would never do that. It's under this precise cover that Jade can do what he needs to. However, if you were to ask him, I don't think that he would be rather honest or forthright about this. He's also not afraid to show his darker side, though. In fact, he even taunts Trey with it in his ceremonial robe vignette, and we can see him talking openly about his dastardly plans in the Ghost Bride event. Beans Day, he's got his own moments, and just on the whole, Jade is not afraid to let frightening comments slip here and there. He seems to relish in taking folks by surprise and seeing their reactions, and more often than not, he does so in a slightly sadistic way, like with the octopus plushie in Harveston. Jade is extremely menacing, but he only ever shows a little piece of himself at any given time and carefully curates a persona that he can show to others, which I think makes him one of, if not the most terrifying character in Twisted Wonderland, at least out of the main cast. But even so, I think it's as delightful as it is necessary given who he is and who he's always adjacent to. So on the personality front, I'm going to be giving Jade a solid 7. Without the sadism, I think Jade would be a bit boring, but having that menacing edge alone also isn't enough for me to rank it higher, despite my bias towards Octave and L, so 7 it is. Where studies are concerned, though, Jade is also a 10 out of 10. I don't think for a second that his grades are slipping with all of the attentiveness he shows in almost all of his actions. He's got a methodical approach that I think rivals that of surgeons when it comes to his work, and he's always one step ahead in his plans, or well, almost always. But the Zoom is technically him, so does that really count? I can't see Jade failing any classes that require memorization or analysis, given how dedicated he is to these two pursuits and other matters. He's able to memorize all sorts of information about Bill, presumably from researching him, which is another point towards Jade's academics. However, Jade is also able to memorize all sorts of complicated scientific names of fungal species and other wild herbs, and he's rather good at reading people, or so it would seem based off of his special magic, general business dealings, and other senses. I don't remember grades being talked about at any point in time in particular with regard to Jade, but I cannot imagine that he's doing poorly, particularly not with his position as Vice House Warden being so technically tenuous, if these three are to be believed at all about their friendship or not friendship. Although, I imagine if he ever stopped enjoying the role that he would just quit, but I doubt he's going to do that anytime soon, just like I doubt he's going to be failing out of school anytime soon. With his terrifying memorization and detail-oriented nature, I feel like I just have to give him a 10 here. Maybe a 9, but I'll settle with a 10, since I feel like he puts in a decent amount of effort, even if that effort goes unspoken. On the card front, Jade's dorm uniform is a defense-type water-fire that has duo with Floyd, unsurprisingly, and it's pretty decent. I don't think this card has ever left my team once after I unlocked the third spell, and while that is almost entirely because of Beans Day Floyd, I do think this card has its own legs with which to stand. The stats are a little less impressive than some of the other defense type cards, but the first spell will give Jade a power boost, which, if used before his duo spell, can be quite useful. The third unlockable spell is Flora, rounding out the elemental roster while also providing a damage cut to foes. With the third spell, this card can go pretty much anywhere and do pretty much anything, and do those things with advantage, potentially, which I think boosts its score quite a bit. I at least like having options and being able to slot Jade into pretty much any team or any context I need it, as he gives a good chunk of HP to the team while also synergizing well with my other cards. Of course, not everyone has an eel with a bean gun, and not everyone wants to revolve their teams around Octave and L, and in those cases, this card probably isn't the best pickup, but it is still generically useful in its utility and its use cases, so I'm gonna give it an 8 here. This means that Jade is getting a total of 25 points. Not bad at all. Last but not least in Octave and L is Floyd. Floyd, boy oh boy, how does one begin to describe a Floyd? This eel is a merman of extremes, although he's not nearly as unpredictable as he seems, at least not to be. Floyd is out for himself in much the same way as the rest of the Octave and L boys, but unlike the other two, he pursues his desires with little regard to others' feelings, perspectives, or comfort. If Floyd wants to do something, he's doing it, and if he doesn't want to, he won't, and there's very little anyone can do to convince him one way or the other. He's not fickle exactly, he's just a bit indulgent. So if he's feeling down, he'll indulge in being grouchy, and if what he's doing is no longer fun, he'll switch tempos or straight up quit, which can cause chaos for those around him, but that doesn't bother him at all. It's not that Floyd is socially unawares, unlike a certain other extreme someone, he just genuinely does not care. Floyd knows what he's doing is going to ruffle feathers, and he does it anyway, which not only makes him a menace, but a fun menace, and he's got the physical and magical power to back up his actions. When Floyd is in the right headspace or invested in what he's doing, he is a force to be reckoned with. When he's in the basketball mood, he can sweep a game, or when he's in a cooking mood, he can make 5-star dishes, and when he has a passing interest in that wild flora guide Jade lent him, he memorized a bunch of plants and saved us from all being poisoned at Vargas camp. But when he's not interested, all of that focus goes right out the window. This can be rather annoying for others and is what makes Floyd so unpredictable to those who don't know him, but he's not entirely unreasonable. And just because he's out for himself doesn't mean he's entirely cruel, right? Ah well, both Floyd and Jade do have a sadistic undertone going on, but because Floyd is so honest about what he's doing at any given time, and is so in your face with his intentions, he kinda comes off a bit more endearing. He's approachable and fun, and yet at the same time he's dangerous. However, even though you know about the risks, there is a certain charisma that just makes him likable. Floyd is a wonderful blend of chaos and a coin flip of sunshine or darkness, but I think if you took enough time to just understand his motives, you'd be able to predict that coin flip somewhat accurately. Whether you could do anything with that prediction is another matter entirely, but regardless, I think I'll be giving this fish a solid 8 out of 10. He's just such an enjoyable fellow, even if he can be a bit spooky at times, and I just think he's a tiny bit superior to his brother. On the studiousness front, it's a bit of a toss-up with Floyd. Like I mentioned before, Floyd is really good at what he does when he is focused and invested, but if he's not, there's no way he's going to do the work. We can see this clearly demonstrated in his Lab War vignette, where Kurel scolds Floyd for not even attempting a quiz and scoring an ice 0, while later, Jade remarks that Floyd scored a full 100 in the last test in that same exact class. It's not a question of if Floyd is studious, it's a question of whether he's going to apply himself to those studies. He's not flunking out of school, but he's also not keeping his grades high either. Plus, he also likes to skip class on occasions if the mood strikes him, so I can't really score him too high here. However, he can also memorize entire books about wild plants and other fantastical feats, so I can't rank him super low either. Therefore, Floyd is going to get a nice middle-of-the-road 5 here. As far as card utility goes, Floyd is a very fun attack-type card with a decent enough stats at max level, and at least a little bit of variety in his spell elements. This card also pairs very well with Jade's dorm uniform in Omni settings, since the two have duo with one another and can cover the elemental gambit with their base spells. Because Floyd is an attack-type card, his spells focus on damage output, or at least that's what you would expect. But at max level, his first spell is actually a modest power drain on foes rather than a boost to caster. You only get that ability with his third unlockable spell, so his card is a bit interesting in that regard, and I think this puts him in a more unique place where utility is concerned. With all three spells unlocked, you can pick which buff you want while still using Duo, since the two differing buffs are on the same spell element. Or if you need Floyd to be all fire, he can do that too. This card can't go everywhere, unfortunately, since the elemental spread is still a bit locked in one side of the triangle, but it does have more applications than some of the other single element dorm cards, so I'm going to give it a final score of 7. This means that Floyd is going to get a total of 20 points. Way less than I thought he would get given my bias, but his studiousness really did him in, I think. Now moving on to Scarabia, and oh my, Mr. Ball of Sunshine Kalim, what are we gonna do with you? This guy is just bursting at the seams with positivity, and I can confidently say that you will not have anyone else on campus that can compete with him there. While Kalim has had a traumatic past with poisonings and kidnappings and almost being turned into puppetings, I wouldn't blame him for being a bit jaded. However, he's surprisingly not. Kalim instead chooses to see the good in people and holds on to hope no matter how dire the circumstances are. This does come with a side of obliviousness, and Kalim is also purposefully blind to the darker intentions of others. However, I do think that this attitude in general is admirable, so I can't help but feel proud of him for always sticking to this perspective. But this also comes with another pitfall, and that is Kalim being oblivious to the discomfort of those around him based on his own actions. Since he looks at the best in people and hopes upon hopes that they'll be good, I think there's also an assumption that other folks are doing the same thing when they are not. This can lead to some moments where Kalim makes a comment in good faith, but the comment itself is really rude, or he imposes his generosity onto others without realizing it could have negative consequences. This is especially true for his relationship with Jamil, which is a complicated matter we won't be getting into here, but no matter who Kalim is involved with, he's nothing if not consistent with his actions. Even with his flaws, Kalim is just so fun, cheerful, and charismatic. You can't help but like the guy. Last time I gave Kalim full marks here because of this, but after further consideration, I'm not sure that's appropriate anymore. The more I thought about his obliviousness, the more it kinda irked me, and while his determination to never let anything get him down is admirable, imposing on others because of it is less so. I'm not going to deduct very much. He's getting an 8.5, which is still quite high, but he's just not as perfect to me as before. When it comes to studies, though, Kalim is less equipped. The poor guy has very bad grades, and while I'm sure Jamil is an excellent tutor, his lessons I don't think are sticking. Part of Kalim's academic downfall is due to his devil-may-care attitude and the amount of parties and hangouts and other things that he sponsors. However, part of it is also probably because of Kalim's learning style. We can see in Book 4 when Octavanel steps in that Kalim can study effectively if he's using the right technique. When both his mind and body are active, things are able to stick better. So I think if he applied this method more, his grades might improve. However, as it stands, all we really know is that he's not failing, and even if he was, a certain someone would probably fudge the numbers to keep that sweet, sweet Asim cash flowing in. Regardless, Kalim just isn't a good student and gets distracted very easily, and while that's not really his fault entirely, I'm sure he wants to do well and help his fellows do well. He's just not quite there yet. So for this category, I'm giving him a 4. Kalim's card, however, is a bit more successful in its endeavors as a water cosmic balance card with an eventual third water spell. This card is locked into similar use cases as Riddle and Azul's, but because it has that cosmic spell, it's a little bit more flexible in certain use cases. As far as abilities go, this card also has a bit more utility too, since you can boost the water damage of your allies, or with the third spell, heal. And that third spell at max level will also give a damage cut to foes. These abilities allow Kalim to be used in a variety of situations with a little wiggle room. However, unlike some of the other cosmic cards we've had, the cosmic spell is the duo spell. Because of this, the first water spell is going to be the one that will apply the water buff, and that buff is only to allies, so you're likely only going to be using this card with other water cards, which locks it into use cases where those types of cards are being used and about. This is not great, but it's also not the worst case scenario since the Cosmic Water was kind of already doing that to begin with. But once that third spell is unlocked, you do have a bit more versatility, so I'm going to rate this card at a 7. Good job, bud. That means the Kalim is getting a whopping 19.5. Not too bad, all things considered. Jamil now. Jamil scares me a little bit because he's not quite as subtle as Jade, but he's also still very menacing and powerful. I can also feel the resentment radiating off of him, which puts me on edge because generally folks that harbor resentment lash out at some point, sometimes even towards those that aren't involved. And oh hey, would you look at that? But Jamil is not the sum of his resentment, nor should he be solely defined by it. So let's look at the rest of him, shall we? Jamil is wickedly smart and highly responsible, who was kind of forced to grow up a little fast, I think, and during that process he had to learn how to hide himself from others. This in turn led him to being perceived as just another ordinary guy with no opinions who goes with the flow. Jamil does his best to keep up this image as well, since anything else would put him and his family in hot water. However, we do get to see glimpses of Jamil underneath this cover during Book 4 and the Firelit Sky event. Jamil is capable, smart, and a bit snarky, which is quite delightful when contrasting Kalim's oblivious sunshine. He also is a realist who understands that life isn't fair and that sometimes you have to do whatever you can do to get ahead. So he doesn't really mind playing dirty if it can get him closer to his goal. He'll absolutely lie if it's advantageous, and it seems as though Jamil learned to turn this deception from a means of survival into a powerful weapon. Even now that he's allowed a piece in the spotlight, Jamil prefers to keep himself out of it and is kind of slowly starting to change that attitude. But I do think that he eventually would want to be seen, or at least will be able to be more comfortable in those scenarios. And that's at least my hope, because beneath all of the lies and deception and subterfuge is a genuinely smart dude who has a huge variety of talents. He can cook, clean, dance, keep Kalim alive, keep Kalim out of trouble, memorize and catalog where any given thing is at any given time, help his doormates make deals that are advantageous, plot extremely well, not just for personal gain, and the list goes on and on. He is an incredible guy that just needs some recognition. So today, I'm going to be giving him a 9, which is just shy of perfect, but it is better than Kalim. So enjoy that while it lasts. For studiousness, I think it would be unfair of me to rank Jamil any lower than a 10 here, but he does purposely tank his grades, so I'm going to purposely tank his score, because we can't have him getting too big ahead now, can we? That said, Jamil is, as previously stated, wicked smart, with a variety of experiences and talents, so he has a lot of practical knowledge to back up his book smarts. We can see this play out in his labware vignette where he applies his cooking knowledge to the alchemy class, at Azul's insistence, which ends up with the pair crafting a successful potion. I think it's also important to point out just how strategic he is with how and where he fails, as we can see him intentionally throwing the Mancala match with enough skill to make Azul question him in Book 4. We also get to see him work with his Soom off of a singular glance to create an entire plan to bore Kalim enough to stop their card game. All of this not only takes smarts but tact, and I would have loved to have given him more than an 8 here, but my hands are tied. As far as his card goes though, this is one that I don't think I've ever actually used, even though it's in my arsenal. However, it is a Cosmic Fire attack type card with an eventual water spell. The max stats are impressive and the power stat specifically is decently high for an attack type card, so because of that, the Cosmic Spell ability focuses on reducing foes' damage instead of boosting Jamil. If you want to boost Jamil instead, you're going to have to unlock that third spell, which will also unlock some utility for the card's use cases too. Overall, it seems like it can be a really good addition to your card library, especially if you're a fan of Scarabia, and it does have more than one element alongside the Cosmic, so you could, in theory, take it to many places. However, it's just not the most useful or stellar card in existence, so I'm gonna rate it at a 7. This means that Jamil is getting a total of 24. Now, Epel here's got enough moxie to build a mountain, and I find him to be a super fun character who poses a lot of good questions. Why should one hide or adjust their accent? What kind of power does beauty and perceived femininity hold? Is there enough milk and meat in the world to help Epel grow an inch or two? Such wonderful questions and thoughts to ponder, and it's nice too that even Epel is pondering them. His character arc was so fun to experience, and while Epel isn't done growing, seeing him finally start to realize some of the points Vil has been making was really cool. That said, this is the personality section, so what is Epel actually like? Well, Epel is a country boy through and through who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty and getting into a scuffle. He's honest overall and will let you know what's on his mind, especially if you tee him off. He's got a competitive streak and never gives up no matter how tall the task, even going so far as to put himself in more danger in order to help out others. There is even a brief moment where Epel tests out wielding his beauty, only to shove the fact that he's a guy into the heckler's face with his fist, which is unnecessary, but on brand. Epel is also rather dedicated to his family and to his hometown, and a lot of his goals revolve around improving the quality of life in Harveston. He wants to revitalize the town and helps the villagers live a more fulfilling life by implementing some specially formulated fertilizers, which I think is a lovely dream. We also get to see that he's a good kid who respects and listens to his elders in the Sledathon event. We also get to see in that event that he's an earnest fellow with a solid head on his shoulders who isn't going to completely forego decency just to ensure his own goals are achieved. He's not going to use underhanded methods to win the sled race. He's not going to leave Sebek behind in the woods. But boy, oh boy, is he going to use his anger as fuel to jump that gap. His competitive nature can come off as a short fuse, but I don't think that Epel ever truly comes off as unreasonable or irritable. Sure, he gets upset, but he doesn't have a hairline trigger like Riddle does, and more often than not, there is a buildup to his anger. I feel that Epel is as endearing as Deuce, just in a slightly different way, because he has more spice to him than Deuce does. While a certain someone is concerned with being an honor student, Epel revels in being a little naughty, since it gives him a chance to test his strength. He really just wants to be a big, strong boy, and he just so happened to be born into a body that is not cooperating. But he'll reconcile with that eventually. Although not every fight is picked with the intention of dominance, some, like the ones in White Rabbit Fest, are picked to defend the honor of others. Epel's not going to let himself or his friends get walked all over, so you better be ready to deal with the consequences if you mess with him and his crew. It's not an unwavering loyalty, but by golly is it still powerful. I think that because Epel is very honest about his motivations, his character comes off in a much more earnest way, and I appreciate that honesty, so Epel is getting an 8 here. On the academic front, Epel is a real good studier for topics that interest him. His labware vignette shows him using his farming knowledge practically, and even though he's succeeding in this specific venture, Epel will still hit the books to learn more. He's got a dream to help Harveston's agricultural landscape, like I mentioned before, which he's really honing in on during his stay at NRC. I don't think we ever hear about Epel's grades specifically, but I can imagine him doing very well, as a certain someone would likely be on his case otherwise. In fact, when it comes to topics that Epel isn't super fond of, like table etiquette, he's not very studious at all. While manners are not part of the NRC curriculum, they are a part of Vil's, and unfortunately Epel is subject to Vil's will due to proximity. He's got voice lessons, etiquette lessons, beauty lessons, lessons about these lessons, and a whole lot more, all of which Epel does not seem to appreciate in the slightest, and he doesn't really practice them as much as he likely should. Should such things be considered for this category? I'm not entirely sure, since school life is about grades, but it is also about a whole lot of other stuff like social interactions. I think that Vil's lessons do kind of count towards understanding how Epel studies and what he prioritizes, as I can imagine him slacking off a little in courses which don't interest him. But I doubt he'd let his grades slip too far lest he have to take remedials with Vil of all people. On the whole, I'm going to give Epel an 8 since he does give his studies decent effort, and even though he's not a fan of Vil's lessons, he is accepting bits and pieces from them, which means he's at least paying attention. Epel's dorm uniform card is a very, very tanky defense type card with water, fire, and eventual flora spells. Yet again, we have a card that can go and do pretty much anything elementally, so that's a point in its favor for sure. As a defense type card, I tend to consider the abilities a bit more heavily, since the damage output won't be as significant, and this card's got some decent utility where this is concerned. The water spell comes with a bit of HP restoration and also drains power on foes for 1 turn, which isn't staggering, but it's something. The floral spell nullifies curses to allies and eventually provides a minor power boost to the caster for that turn. The order of operations doesn't necessarily matter too much for these abilities, since the boosts will only last for the turn that they're used, so the flow of battle will largely dictate when and where they are used. But on the whole, this card is above average and has some decent things going for it. I don't have it myself, but I do think it could be very useful overall, so I'm going to rate it at an 8. This means that Epel is going to receive 24 total points. Rook now took all my words away. He gets to use them now, not me, and boy does he use them well. I don't really know where to begin to describe Rook. He's got a lot of little facets that combine to make a dazzling personality, but I guess the most prominent piece of him is his charisma. This guy can talk to anyone about pretty much anything while keeping the conversation genuine. Plus, he has the added grace and social awareness to know how to carefully craft his words to put others at ease. Sure, sometimes this flowery language is more confusing than helpful, but you can just feel the good intentions pouring off of him, so it's a bit hard to be mad in either case. One of the other bits of Rook that becomes very obvious after spending a few minutes near him is that he is ridiculously passionate. Whatever he's interested in, he's invested in 100%, and he'll delightedly tell you all about that thing or person if you ask. He also relentlessly pursues that which he thinks is beautiful, which is as valid as any other kind of devotion, I suppose. But it is ultimately what led him to his current position and his current relationships, and I love that for him. At the end of Book 5, we find out from Nej just how dedicated Rook is to him, and I honestly wish I had a fraction of that energy because wow, just wow. But of course, every rose has its thorns, and Rook also has his bad habits too. As in pursuit of beauty, Rook likes to stalk individuals to find out more about them, and is not above crawling through the bushes to get that perfect covert angle. He is also interested in hunting, as his name might suggest, and so he also enjoys covertly crawling through the bushes to gain intel on potential prey or prey species. It's very creepy, but Rook manages to counteract that with his endless wellspring of charisma, and somehow he's still incredibly likable. He's got the heart of a poet, the eyes of an artist, and the determination of a hunter, which rounds him out quite well and gets him an 8 in my book. Now, for studiousness, there is no way you can tell me that Rook Hunt is failing. This guy has the entirety of the school's height, weight, species, dorm, class memorized, and while this may be the result of a fixation, it's still ridiculously impressive. Not only that, but Rook is the vice housewarden of Pomfiore, a position he would not be in if his grades were slipping, because somehow I don't think Vil would ever allow such a thing. Plus, we also get to see a few instances of Rook mentoring his underclassmen in both academics, as seen in Leona's Labor vignette, and manners, as seen in Epel's ceremonial robes vignette. He has a wide variety of knowledge, and he's very graceful in his teachings as well, regardless of the subject, which all essentially means that Rook is set when it comes to academics. And to add yet another feather into his cap, Rook is also a member of the Science Club, which centers around a subject which can be very difficult to understand and execute. Yet it seems like Rook does extremely well in this pursuit too, when he's not scaring the freshman members at least. But even then, he's still sciencing well, so that's something. Given how well Rook seems to be doing in all of his other pursuits, I'm gonna give him a 9 here. It's a bit unknown if this general knowledge is a result of studying or are just things he's picked up throughout his life, and I don't know how well he'd be doing if he didn't have the extra motivation of being near Vil, so I'm not gonna give him a perfect score, but a 9 is still extremely solid. For his card, Rook has a Flora, Fire, and eventual Water attack type card with decent stats and interesting abilities. At max level on his first spell, he's got the standard power boost to caster, but on his unlockable third spell, he not only has a damage boost, but minor HP regen for 3 turns. I love me an HP regen, and this I think unlocks a bit more utility for the card beyond the elemental spread, which automatically gains this card points because Rook can go anywhere and do pretty much anything once that third spell is unlocked. This is fantastic because you can have a strong attacker and a healer wrapped into one, or you can just blast your opponents with magical damage. The choice is yours, and having that choice is fantastic. The stats are somewhat standard for this type of card, and while it isn't the strongest of the bunch, it can go in pretty much every use case and has enough utility to work in those use cases, so I'm giving it an 8 here. That means that Rook is going home with 25 total points. Next up is Vil Schoenheit. Now, Vil is a character that I initially dreaded meeting because celebrities can sometimes be a bit much with their entitlement and self-absorption. And because Vil is based off of the evil queen whose entire shtick is vanity, I was bracing myself for an incredibly vain and entitled character. But I'm sure you can imagine my relief when I found out that Vil is nothing like that. In fact, he's one of the most reasonable and probably mature characters in the main cast. Outside of his one little obsession, Vil has his head on straight, and he pursues his goals with a relentless determination that is very admirable. His desire to be the best in the world is less about the shallow satisfaction of clout and more about personal growth and accomplishment. Vil wants to be the best because he wants to be the best. The praise is all well and good, and he absolutely loves his efforts being recognized, but he's not chasing that applause solely for the endorphins. I think some of this perspective was shaped by his childhood, and honestly props to his dad, who we've not yet met as of this recording. But he must have done so well to not spoil Vil, despite all of his and Vil's successes, and I think that worked out, in the long run, so well for not only him, but for Vil. However, I do think with all of the modeling and the movies and other jobs Vil has taken on from a very young age, he's probably grown up a little faster than his peers, which may be why he feels a bit more mature overall, even though he is still very much an adolescent that also makes terrible decisions, as adolescents tend to do. On the whole, though, Vil doesn't really seem to be concerned about the little scuffles, and he's not going to get hung up on things that aren't worth his time. He's worked way too hard to get where he is for someone else's temper tantrum to ruin it, but he's also not completely unreasonable and does recognize others' talents, no matter who they are. One very good example of this is Ortho. Ortho is an android in an extremely unique position, and apparently a lot of other folks at the school took him for granted as just an android prior to Book 6. Vil may have been among them at the time, however, after Book 6, Vil recognizes Ortho's talents for acting like he would for any of his human peers, which I think is fantastic. This, along with everything else that we've already discussed, really rounds out Vil, and while he is still quite dedicated to the things that are important to him, which kind of limits his sphere of influence and somewhat pigeonholes him, overall, I think he's still very admirable, and I'm so glad they went this route with his character. The more time I've spent with Vil, the more time I've come to respect him. So in the personality department, I'm gonna give him a 9.5. I still don't like him as much as some other characters. However, I can't deny just how well written and nuanced he is. And because he subverted my expectations and is so much better than what I imagined him to be, I gotta give him some extra points. When it comes to his studies, Vil is not slacking at all. From my memory of the story and the vignettes I have, we don't really get to see his academics mentioned very much, so I've always assumed that that means that he can't be doing that bad. However, when it comes to Vil specifically, the fact that he's able to not only lead Pomfiore, but also lead a dance troupe, and during all of that, maintain his grades is just astonishing. I don't think I'd ever survive such pressure, but not only does Vil survive, he does so with grace, and I think that speaks volumes to his tenacity. There are some topics where Vil excels, like in alchemy, and we can see him doing well in these pursuits in various story beats. I also did a little digging like I did with Ruggie to see if I could find anything else about Vil's grades, and in some of the vignettes I don't have, like his Bloom Broom story, Vil remarks that his flight grades are average, but only his flight grades are average, which I guess is fair enough given his reasoning. But the more important point from this vignette that I think justifies just how well Vil is doing academically is that he had no prior magical experience before coming to NRC. The only thing he did have knowledge of was how to craft cosmetics, but everything else that he's accomplished on the magic front, aside from probably his unique magic, because I don't think know exactly when that manifested, has been at NRC. Given how strong Vil is, this is no small feat at all, and I think he's absolutely put in the work. I'm a bit blown away by this fact, honestly, given the everything else about Vil, but also considering that it kind of makes sense. Vil is very dedicated to acting and to his personal pursuits, and if he were to be doing anything poorly at school, the tabloids would pick it up in a second. Plus, I don't think that he would forgive himself for not doing his best, since he's striving to perfect every other aspect of his life. No matter how you spin it, this is just impressive, and for it, Vil is going to get a 10. Now, Vil's card is a Flora, Cosmic, and Eventual Flora defense type card. The first spell at max level will place a modest curse on foes along with a minor power drain, while the third unlockable spell applies a longer lasting modest power drain. This card is built for defense exams and outlasting opponents, as you'll be able to negate most of their damage if using both utility spells. However, to do that, you likely won't be going up against fire enemies, given the Flora elements. The Cosmic spell inclusion does open up doors for use cases, but this card can't go everywhere since it's still otherwise locked in Flora. Even though this is the case, the Curse ability is quite unique and on brand for Vil, and it can be incredibly useful in certain contexts like battle map tiles where enemies heal, or some of those stubborn story battles, and even in some overblot fights. While it's not the greatest defense type card out there, it does have its place, and in that place it does very well. I just can't justify ranking it too high because it is also still limited, so it's going to get a 6.5 here. Meaning, Vil is going to receive 26 total points in this contest. Now then, Ortho is a bubbly, charismatic humanoid who I love to bits, even when he was being a bit evil. The fact that one of the tower puzzles was to find the phrase "do your best" is not only hilarious, but I think it speaks to Ortho's optimistic nature overall. For a being who's only recently become sentient, Ortho has a love of life and genuine curiosity that I think folks give up on the older they get. Perhaps this is because Ortho is still very young and is based off of and eventually becomes Idia's younger brother, but there is a wonder to him that's just infectious. He's not a complete ball of sunshine like Kalim, but he's certainly a cutie, and even though he's optimistic, he's not afraid to be a bit of a brat, and it's delightful. Ortho knows exactly which strings to pull with the folks that he's close to get what he wants, especially with Idia. Ortho, in fact, is the sole reason that the star sending even happens in the Wish Upon a Star event, because if he didn't talk about how disappointed he would be for it to not happen, then Idia would have never involved himself in changing the weather and it never would have happened. While this sort of thing doesn't always work, like with Ortho's ceremonial gear vignette, I think it works more often than not, at least to trigger major events, which makes it a very useful quality for him to have. The same thing happens with his mother in Book 7, where he threatens her into compliance to create the Cerberus gear. He is also able to manipulate the whole situation with Trey in his dorm uniform vignette, which is very sneaky, but also very smart. Bratty probably isn't the best way to describe him, though he does have his moments. But I do think that Ortho is not one to be taken advantage of. He's not malicious, but he's not going to stand for anyone defaming his brother or those that he cares about. And because of that, he's learning how to toe the line between teaching people a lesson and total annihilation of those people. Given how earnestly Ortho is trying to learn how to live and his general cheery disposition, it's very hard to take his more diabolical actions too seriously. To me, he's kind of like a cat in that way, where he's completely untangled my ball of yarn and strewn it around the house in the most chaotic spiderweb. But how can I stay mad at that cute little fluffy face? Since Ortho is still learning, I'm also willing to forgive more of his faults compared to some of the other folks who have had a lot of time to learn and grow. Though Ortho's got a wealth of internet knowledge, he doesn't have the experience to really know how to apply it. So the path of least resistance is a very reasonable path for him to take, even if it does destroy half of the campus. So I can understand where he's coming from in these areas a little bit better, so they're not as much of a demerit. Ortho is getting a 10 out of 10 here. I just like him too much to deduct any points for his more dubious pieces, and honestly, everyone's gotta be able to push back a little bit every now and again. And I just find him so delightful that I don't really want to rank him any lower than this. With regards to studiousness, Ortho is a unique case. This kid has the entirety of the internet at his fingertips all day, every day, so Ortho's academic career is pretty much set provided the information he needs is on the web. Ortho is already pretty knowledgeable about a variety of topics because of this, so I can't imagine he'd be failing his classes. Since he's only recently joined the official student body, he doesn't really have grades for me to critique at this point. But given how he handled all of Idia's housewarden work before, and has probably helped him with his schoolwork on occasion, I think this means that Ortho is apt to win this category of book smarts alone. But that feels a little cheesy and a little unfair, especially since school is not solely about grades. So I think it would be better to score Ortho based on how well he's studying life. Since he gained sentience, Ortho has been on a quest to understand what life is and how to do it, which I think he's doing quite well. First order of business was to join the Film Research Club to better understand the actual emotions beneath the acting, to really feel them and really understand what they mean. Ortho had actually watched movies in the past to learn how to emote properly during conversations, but now he's seeking out more depth and is doing so with gusto. In the second Fairy Gala, Ortho has to reconcile what evolution means to him and how he can bring such a vision to life. The other freshmen pool their efforts to help Ortho not only figure out what he's going to do, but to help him achieve it, which is super wholesome, but also served as its own kind of learning opportunity. In pursuit of life, Ortho is doing rather well, and while it may take him a while to fully get it, I think he'll get there eventually, especially since he'll likely outlive hundreds of generations of humans. However, for this studiousness, I am going to give Ortho a total of 8 points. Now onto the card. Ortho's card is another attack type with a versatile element spread of fire, water, and eventually flora. As has been the trend, the first spell has the damage boost for 3 turns, which makes it really useful if it can be used first. The second is self-explanatory with Duo, and the third one offers a bit more utility. This spell will nullify freeze for allies and gives Ortho a bit of a boost for himself during that turn. To be honest, I don't consciously encounter freeze that much. I think it certainly has its place in the story battles, but it's not a threat I've ever really personally cared about or noticed when it's happening. Given that the rest of this card is very standard for this consideration, with the same sort of utility as Aces, I'm going to give this card a 7 as well. It absolutely has its place, and having the spell versatility is a huge boon, but it's not going to take over some of the others. This means that Ortho is taking home 25 total points. Next up is Idia Shroud, who at first glance is your typical soft-spoken, socially anxious introvert. However, when he opens his mouth, you get to see a whole new side of him, and as we've spent more time with him in Book 6 and 7, I've started to appreciate his character a bit more. Idia is reserved and doesn't like leaving his room, which is further reinforcing his social anxiety. However, in the right circumstances, Idia is well-spoken, although at times a bit blunt. And in these situations, his experiences and knowledge really get to shine. If he's playing a board game or chatting over the internet, he has absolutely no problem voicing his opinions or keeping casual conversation. But as soon as he's confronted by an IRL person without a buffer, he falls apart a bit. There are also a lot of activities that Idia is reluctant to participate in because they involve socialization or are to develop skills he feels like he'll never practically use. So what's the point in that, right? However, regarding activities that he does value, the dude almost cannot be stopped. Idia has a variety of technical talents and is wickedly smart in the STEM department, even having a bunch of little startups and other little projects going on at any given time. With his technical genius comes a great deal of pride and therefore some condescension, which has led to some fantastically unfortunate moments when he starts running his mouth. However, Idia isn't all quiet or all jerk. He's a nice mix of both, and he can also be surprisingly realistic. In fact, Idia seems to be the most generally aware character, since he can call out others for their ridiculous actions and clock absurdities scarily well. He's also the only character who fourth wall breaks and hints at the existence of the game, or the existence of game limitations, within the world. Part of this might be just attributed to his gamer instincts, since he usually incorporates gaming terms into his general speech, so he may just be relating his personal experience to a video game, not to twists specifically, but sometimes it feels like it's a lot more informed than that, and I find it to be a very interesting piece of his character. And honestly, for me, Idia is rather relatable. I too wish that I didn't have to leave my house, or teach people how to use certain applications on the daily despite not being employed for tech support, and I also hate physical activities, and my social battery drains ridiculously fast, and when you see pieces of yourself in others, I think you tend to subconsciously like them a bit more. Also, I nearly died of laughter during the Igni section of Book 7, and that specifically has skyrocketed my opinion of Idia, so this time around I'm giving Idia an 8 for personality. Good job, buddy. When it comes to his studies, everything outside of athletics has to be 10s across the board, so I've got to give him a 10 here. The dude is a self-certified genius, and while STEM talents do not necessarily transfer over to subjects like art and history, I doubt Idia's had any true trouble with them. He seems to have in his information intake down, and I'm also unsure that he'd have gotten so many internships thrown at him if his grades were in the gutter. I suppose, on the other hand, having a stellar research project would be able to kind of counteract any bad grades you might have, since I can't really imagine that your specialized day job in tech would necessarily require you to have memorized a lot of historical dates. But who am I to say such things? Although I really just can't foresee that being an issue, and I think all of the studying that Idia had to do to get to the point where he is at with his technological skills is impressive enough on his own, let alone anything else that he's done at NRC. The only thing potentially holding him back is his PE grades because the boy is terrified of physical activity. In fact, he's so bad at running and despises it so much that he created a whole gear for Ortho to run for him so he could live up to Vargas's expectations, which completely defeats the point of the exercise. But the fact he was able to do that in such little time with a bit of time watching Jack, I think is way more impressive and noteworthy here. So because Idia gets 10s across the board in pretty much everything else to my knowledge, as far as I'm aware anyways, I didn't do as extensive research on him as I did for Vil and Ruggie and other characters, but despite all of that, I'm still gonna give him a 10 here. From a card perspective though, Idia's dorm uniform is quite unique, and it has an ability that I don't believe any of the other dorm uniform cards has, and this ability is just so fitting for Idia's character. This card is a Fire, Cosmic, and Eventual Fire defense type card that at max level has debuff removal for allies and power drain to foes on its first spell, with Nullify Blind for allies and a power cut to foes on its third spell. The debuff removal will work for any debuff in the game, so if used properly, this can be a game changer during the flow of battle. Of course, an ability this powerful has to be balanced somehow, and so it's coupled with the fire element on the first spell, so you likely won't be using it or this card generically against water enemies, which does limit the use cases for this card and therefore the usefulness of the buff. However, having this card seems like it'd be so good for those pesky story battles where you're constantly getting blinded or burned, or what have you, because Idia can just zap away that for one of the characters at the very least. And because of this card is getting an 8. All in all, Idia is ending up with 25 total points. Not so bad. Next up is Sebek, who is an acquired taste. In fact, he was barely palatable for me for most of the game. I really thought that Sebek and Silver hated each other, or at least that Sebek hated Silver and Silver was a little too oblivious to notice, because, well, that's just Sebek, and I hated that dynamic. Thankfully, this is not the truth, but Sebek is still a very abrasive individual. The first Vargas camp really did Sebek dirty and made him just so obnoxious. And since that was the first time I really encountered his personality, it did impact my view of him heavily. Like, I get that you're a fanboy of Malleus. I get that. And if your personality was just that, I think I could deal better. But the human thing, that really gets annoying real quick. Because it's not quirky like some of the other characters. Like, Floyd's nicknames are quirky, and those do come with a condescending undertone, but they're not terrible, and they're not necessarily targeting a thing that you can't really change. Like, I don't know, man. Baby Seal and Grim make sense. Perhaps I'm a bit too sensitive, but all of the backhanded compliments and the condescension and the refusal to change even when those he respects call him out on this behavior is just so annoying. The cast as a collective have so much patience when it comes to this that it's honestly admirable, and while I understand where Sebek's attitude comes from, I just think that he needs to reconcile with his own mortality, get out more, and move on. I'm very curious about whether or not all of this human talk is largely just a facade to impress his grandfather, since we find out in Book 7 that Bauer is a very cold, reserved old man, who is still also kind of reconciling with his daughter marrying a human. He doesn't really take this out on the grandchildren at all, but it's definitely still there, and they can definitely still pick up on it, and given how much time Sebek spends with him, It's not really surprising that Sebek has this habit. However, it's not like Sebek is opposed to recognizing human people's talents either, like he does with Marja. And sometimes his human talk feels more like prideful baying than malicious condescension, like in his apple palm vignette. Aside from this, Sebek is honestly rather delightful, and his interactions with other characters are much more entertaining to me now that I have more of his backstory. Sure, he's arrogant, but he's ridiculously devoted and is constantly trying to improve himself to better serve Malleus. This improvement is mainly stuck in the physical realm, but it is improvement nonetheless. And on the whole, Sebek is a rather resourceful lad, and above all, he is earnest. He will tell you exactly what he thinks and will break the sound barrier while doing so. But he's also not opposed to changing his viewpoint in most matters when new information is presented, and I think that this is super important to recognize. He is firm but not completely unreasonable, and he does genuinely care about those that he loves. This just gets overshadowed by his loudness and the other negative qualities. Since Sebek is so earnest, so devoted, and so honest, I'm ranking him the same as Ace and Grim here. The human thing unsettles me enough to keep him from ranking any higher, but good job, bud. Getting a 6. Congrats. In the realm of studiousness, as far as I can tell, Sebek is doing just fine. There is absolutely no way that he is failing any of his classes as one of Malleus's retainers. Such a thing is inconceivable. But I don't actually remember any part of the story where his grades get discussed in any way. I imagine since Sebek is in good standing academically that there really wouldn't be any reason to bring up his grades. Although I think he might still be a little behind Silver, maybe, if I am remembering correctly. He's at least behind him when it comes to martial prowess, which annoys him. So he might be behind a little bit in grades. I don't really know. But that doesn't really mean all that much for this consideration. Given how determined Sebek is with every other aspect of his life and of his training, I can't see academics falling to the wayside. He scaled an entire cliff to get a flower to win a challenge in Vargas camp, and you're trying to tell me that this guy isn't pulling out all of the stops for algebra? No way. Especially when Sebek gets to gloat all of his A's to Malleus and receive Malleus's praise. Why would he ever neglect his studies when such a prize is on the line? In a similar way to Ortho, though, I don't think that academics should be like the whole focus of Sebek's tenure at NRC, and I think he should focus a little bit more on his interpersonal relationship skills. While this is just my opinion, if I were to consider it, Sebek's score would drop a little here since he really needs to broaden his horizons and actually see people for their value rather than trying to fit them all into his ideals of worth. School is a place where all sorts of things can happen, so I hope that after Book 7's debacle, he gets the chance to, at some point, engage with his non-Fae, non-Diasomnia peers a bit more. With this little mini rant over, I'm going to give him an 8 since he really is dedicated in pretty much every other area. Now, on the card front, Sebek's dorm uniform is interesting because if you just look at the stats, he's pretty lacking compared to the other attack type cards we've had on this list. With a water, flora, and eventual fire spell, though, this card is still versatile where elements are concerned. In theory, you could use this card in pretty much every situation, like Aces, and the abilities are rather comparable as well. You get the 3-turn damage boost on the first spell, and you get the 3-turn HP regen on the unlockable fire. However, this unlockable spell has a slightly more useful buff of nullifying blind to caster instead of another damage boost. Assuming that Sebek isn't frozen, this buff could be extremely useful, particularly in the early stages of Book 7. He's not as heavy a hitter to begin with, but being able to guarantee that he can hit regardless is very nice indeed. Since I like this certainty a bit more, Sebek's card is receiving a 7. which leaves Sebek with a total of 21 points, which is a little wild. I didn't think he was going to rank this high. But that means next up is our gentle, sleepy Silver. This guy is such a sweetie, and of all the more heroic-leaning folks at NRC, I feel like Silver is the best because he has a softness to him that I think adds to his personality. Silver is soft-spoken, humble, but still firm in his convictions and loyal to those he holds dear. Silver is never going to go out of his way to hurt anyone unless they're actively threatening him, and even when they are, he still takes the time to try to understand their perspective, like we can see in Glorious Masquerade. He's not rash or bold, but he still has the skills to defeat his foes and back up his allies. Given his upbringing, it's no wonder that this is the case, as even though Lilia was a rather tough general, I think Lilia's travels opened his eyes quite a bit to the large variance within folks, and this is something that I believe was passed down from Lilia to Silver. In fact, Silver's ultimate goal is for everyone of every race and creed to get along and to be at peace with one another, which is so wholesome. It's no wonder that the wild animals flock to him and help him out whenever he's got a little problem. Even though he is so wholesome, he's not perfect, and he does have a bad habit of falling asleep whenever and wherever he happens to be. All this is mainly outside of his control. His denseness isn't, and this gets him into trouble quite often. Silver is serious, but to a bit of a fault, as he believes the world to be as earnest as he is, so he doesn't quite suspect people that he otherwise should, and he sometimes ends up in a bit of a pickle because of it. But I think even this can make him very endearing. He's oblivious in a very different way from Kalim, and he does consider others' perspectives and feelings, so I'm going to be giving Silver the 10 this time around. I just find him to be such a lovely little guy, and while he's not the most exciting character on the surface, I do think his convictions and overall nature make him shine bright enough to maybe rival Kalim. When it comes to studying, though, Silver is a bit lackluster. I don't think this is for any lack of trying, and he can and does excel in some areas, but because he falls asleep so often, I have no doubt that he misses key information in classes or just might not be able to finish tests or quizzes, which could result in reduced grades. Sebek even points out at one point that he has better grades than Silver, I believe, and that Silver should take a page out of his book, which, if this isn't just boasting, means that Silver's not doing as well as he probably should be. However, I do think he's trying his best and is doing well enough since he made it a whole year without failing out of school. Plus, I think a little tutoring from Dad every once in a while probably helps as well. Since he's trying his best even though the results aren't spectacular, I'm willing to give Silver a 7 here. It's a bit above average, and I think that fits his efforts in this category. For Silver's dorm card, we have a Cosmic, Flora, and Eventual Water Defense type card. The stats are decent enough for this card type, and we've got a damage cut to foes on the first spell, which will help your team tank quite a bit of damage. The Cosmic spell means this card can go in a lot more places than some of the other element-dependent cards, as we have talked about many times before, and the Eventual Water spell opens up some more opportunities too. The other interesting thing about the Water spell is that it comes with an evasion boost to caster, meaning Silver may be able to avoid taking damage altogether, which makes this a great card for defense exams or for those tough story battles where you've just got to stay alive for long enough. I feel like this card can be really useful with that third spell, but until it's unlocked, it's somewhat standard as a defense card. However, the evasion ability is still really unique, so I think that will still bump this card up to an 8, meaning that Silver is going to get 25 total points. Next is Malleus Draconia, our legendary, extraordinary gargoyle-loving dragon, who's honestly very much a vibe. He's demure, refined, and noble. However, he isn't very mindful, at least in the way that translates well to his peers. Malleus has lived his entire life in the Briar Valley and is considered a national treasure due to the circumstances of his birth. So his interactions with others during his childhood have been limited and formal. At least it seems that way from the information that we have. Because of this, Malleus can be a little awkward at times and doesn't quite understand some of the nuances of the modern human world, which can lead to some confusion. Up until the Firelight Sky event, he'd never ridden in a car. His cell phones are constantly getting reduced to rubble due to him not understanding technology. He's had a bit of difficulty cracking eggs in the culinary crucible, and his dorm uniform vignette clearly demonstrates a lack of fundamental human knowledge. These things aren't expressly his fault, and Malleus, for his part, is trying his darndest to understand this new world. In fact, it's the very reason that Lilia brought him to NRC, and I do think it's doing him good. But despite his faults, Malleus is still very much a big sweetie who's very happy to host, is delighted to be received, and pays back kindness with kindness. Sometimes he gets a little too extravagant with his gifts, but given how ridiculously powerful Malleus is, it does kind of make sense. And while sometimes these gifts are also a little self-serving, they're still very much appreciated. Except that one gift, but we're still working through that. His relationship with those in Deisomnia is positive, and even his interactions with others are generically good and sometimes even playful. In the Firelight Sky event, Jamil is stressed because of Malleus' status. However, no one in the town actually knows who he is, so everyone just approaches him like he's a normal person, and Malleus is delighted. A similar thing happens in Glorious Masquerade, and in both events we get to see Malleus be respectful of these new people while also being curious about their lives, wares, and cultures. I think this curiosity really underscores Malleus too, because everything in the human world is new to him. All the customs, the technology, the food, the people, all of it is new, and he doesn't reject any of it. In fact, he wishes he could experience more of it. However, his near infinite wellspring of power keeps a lot of folks from approaching him, which unfortunately limits his learning. In any case, though, Malleus is a wonderful character whose actions are consistent if nothing else. It's really just the tone of these actions that change depending on how familiar he is with someone. And just because he's formal doesn't mean he also isn't cheeky at times. We see in his PE uniform vignette that he gets a little salty at Cater, calling him essentially unapproachable, before Cater asks for a favor. So Malleus obliges in order to be polite, but then purposely messes up each and every picture to get his point across. While this is hilariously petty, it also feels a bit like a boundary definition, and it is done in a way that's rather graceful overall, which I think combined with everything else sums up Malleus nicely. He's a complex character with a lot of facets and a certain kind of innocence that makes him stand out from the rest of NRC, so I can't help but give him a 9 here. For studiousness, though, I have to treat Malleus in the same way as Ortho because Malleus has been tutored in magic by the best of the best for decades. NRC has nothing it can really teach him on the magic front, so he likely doesn't have to study at all to ace anything that would have to do with magic, or history, or athletics. Therefore, I need to rank his social studiousness instead, since the bulk of what Malleus is here to do is to make friends and learn about other species, and he's kinda tried, but he's not done particularly well. Part of this is because of his overwhelming power, as it intimidates all of those around him into not approaching him, and when he approaches others, it's often looked at as a life or death situation, even though it is very much not that, as we can see in Malleus's labware vignette. However, Malleus doesn't really make an effort to engage with others either, unless he needs something from them, at least from what we can see. I think this is in part him knowing about all the rumors swirling around school and perhaps not wanting to make others uncomfortable, and partially because his own experiences are so different from those around him, it can be hard to relate. The poor boy unintentionally ruffles feathers and doesn't have the experience to understand why what he did made folks upset, like we can see in his dorm uniform vignette, and at the beginning of Book 7. And while I have faith that he'll get there eventually, right now he's struggling a bit. I feel like this sort of study is something that he really wants to do, as he is rather curious and does want to make friends, and in the long run, I think it would benefit him greatly. But up until Book 7 and even during it, at least up to the current point of its release in EN, he doesn't seem to have learned all that much in this department. So unfortunately for Malleus, I'm going to rank him out of 5 because he has made some effort, but he's got a long way to go. On the card front, though, Malleus has to get a high score because this fully cosmic powerhouse attack type card with critical chance is just so fun. The card's abilities on the first and third spell at max level are critical chance to oneself or allies respectively, which means this card or your other party members have a chance to dish out even more damage than normal. If you're able to get this boost onto one of your other cards that also has elemental advantage, you can raise your enemies. Of course, to balance this card itself, its elements are cosmic, and one more cosmic, since this elemental type doesn't have any advantages or disadvantages. This means Malleus will be doing consistent damage in every battle without any extras besides his crit chance. But hey, consistent damage is consistent damage, and when the crits work, they work great. Given that this card is an attacker and attacks well, I'm going to give it an 8, again because it feels so useful, but also because it feels like you might have to babysit it a little bit, depending on the course of the battle that you're in and which of the buffs you've chosen to take. So these sorts of situational changes can somewhat affect the card's performance, which has tanked the score a little bit. However, on the whole, it's extremely decent, so it's still getting the 8. And with that, Malleus is receiving 22 total points. Last but not least is Lilia Van Rouge, the best peepaw at NRC. And if that was our contest, then Lilia would win. But this is the best junior competition, so let's chat about that personality. Lilia, on the whole, is a rather easygoing individual who is more focused on living his own life than fretting about others. However, that is not to say he doesn't care about anyone at all. In fact, Lilia is a rather dedicated mentor figure to pretty much all of Deusomnia, making him the father friend of the group, and to a few individuals in the dorm, he's an actual father figure. Despite his prankster tendencies and easygoing nature, Lilia is much older than he appears, and with that age comes a ton of experience that he uses in those contexts to mentor his peers and adopted kiddos. In fact, it's likely because of Lilia's extensive travels and experience that he gets along so well with so many people, and why he may not be as concerned about some of the pettier problems of his peers. Lilia is also ridiculously dedicated to his charges, and he does take care of them extremely well. However, he knows better than to be overbearing, since some lessons can only ever be taught by life, so he does his best to strike a balance there. And while on the whole he's relaxed, there are times where the strict general of the past comes out, like during the Leona confrontation at the end of Book 2 and his rebuke of Sebek in the beginning of Book 7. He even gets a casual dig-in at Azul and co. at the beginning of Book 7 too, as the trio were directly involved in the events of Book 2, which up until this point in the story, I don't think anyone in Deusomnia addressed directly with Octavanel, but it is a clear example of Lilia setting up boundaries and expectations with his peers that even though he isn't holding too much of a grudge, they aren't getting away without any consequence. But at the end of the day, peace is the greater goal. To this end, Lilia is also very mature, which is also, again, probably due to his life experiences, but this can often catch his peers by surprise since Lilia, by all accounts, really doesn't act or seem old. But his nuggets of wisdom are golden, and while he isn't infallible, he's still a very solid guy, so he's going to get a solid 10 here. I find him to be such a fun dude that has so much more depth than you'd ever expect by appearances alone, and I personally enjoy that complexity enough to give him full marks here. From a studying perspective, Lilia doesn't really have to study. At least, I don't think that he does, and I don't really remember any instance of his grades being discussed, so I don't really know how to rank him here. Lilia has lived through a lot and has been to so many different places and has had so much experience that it's hard to imagine him doing poorly in any of the school subjects. He's also not only Fae, but a battle-hardened Fae, so any magic-based lessons are going to be a breeze too. Much like Malleus, Lilia is also likely at the school to seek out new social experiences while also keeping an eye on Malleus. And while that doesn't guarantee he'd be doing well academically, I feel like he'd have to intentionally fail for his grades to be low. However, he also doesn't have the best memory and can be seen talking about how forgetful he is every once in a while, which I suppose could be a problem. But even still, I doubt it's affecting this area of his life too much. So, because of this, I'm a little bit lost. It's not as cut and dry of a case like Ortho or Malleus, where I can just rate how well they're doing at becoming more relatable to their peers, because Lilia already does that. Rating his cooking skills would be out of pocket and unfair, and rating his mentorship or the lessons he teaches would net him a 10 anyway, right? Or would it? Lilia does a fairly good job at guiding the rest of the Diasomnia boys, and he encourages them to learn on their own while also stepping in to correct them when they are wrong. There is a delicate balance in the approach that Lilia takes to encounter these youths, as he doesn't wish to stifle them, yet he also cannot in good faith let them fall too far from grace. In this, though, I think Lilia can sometimes be a bit too lenient with the boys will be boys attitude, and for that I'm going to knock off a few points from his score. I'm not sure that the Book 7 rebuke of Sebek was the only one Lilia ever gave him. However, it is the only one that we get to witness, and for the rest of the story, up until this point, Sebek's bad habits are kind of ignored by those around him, including Lilia. With this in mind, I'll be giving Lilia an 8 here. He's very good at what he does, but he's not perfect, so that's where he'll rank. From a card perspective, Lilia's got a Flora Cosmic Defense type card with an eventual unlockable Flora spell. The stats are quite good, and so is the utility, so at first glance, the card appears solid. The first spell has Power Drain on foes for 1 turn, and the third spell has both Curse and Nullify Blind for 2 and 1 turn respectively. The abilities of that unlockable spell are really nice, so of course they're locked behind the uncaps, but with them, this card can be a good ally in battle. Unfortunately, having 2 of the same element does lock this card into certain use cases, so it's not perfect, but it's decent enough to get itself an 8 in my book. Which means that Lilia is getting a very snazzy 26 for his total points. So, now that we have all our points tallied for all our boys, it's time to sort them into the final ranking. However, there is a bit of a problem, as we have so many ties for so many places, and I'm not making y'all sit here through that many coin flips. Therefore, in order to accurately and definitively decide who is the best of the best at NRC, I asked you lovely viewers to help me out by voting for your faves in a very short-lived but rather fruitful form. And y'all did not disappoint. Every vote that a character received gave them a bonus point in this consideration. So hopefully now, with all of these bonuses added in, we won't have nearly as many ties as before. And we don't! Huzzah! Of course, there will still be a few trials for some folks to overcome, and we do have a coin flip for first. But let's leave that dramatic tension for the very end, shall we? In last place, we have Trey Clover. In 23rd place, we have Cater. In 22nd place, we have Grim. In 21st place, we have Kalim. In 20th, we have Jack. In 19th place, we have you coming in 19th, Jamil coming in 18th, and Ruggie winning the rock, paper, scissors for 17th. In 16th place, we have Leona, who got himself out of the scuffle by virtue of his half point. In 15th place, we have Rook. In 14th, we have Floyd winning the coin toss. In 13th is Sebek. In 12th is Epel. Coming in at number 11 is Jade. Coming in at number 10 is Vil. Coming in at number 9 is Azul. And coming in at number 8, we have Ortho, Ace, or Ace. We have Ace coming in 8th and Ortho coming in 7th. We have Idia coming in 6th, Deuce in 5th, Riddle in 4th, and then for our top 3, we have a Diasomnia sweep with Malleus in 3rd, and then either Silver or Lilia in 1st. Let's find out who it shall be. Ready? Flip. First result is in Lilia's favor. Second coin. In Lilia's favor. Sorry, Silver, you gotta move out of the way. Because Epel Lilia sweeps best student at NRC. He is the best of the best of the best. Congratulations to Lilia for winning this competition. But as always, if you have different thoughts and you think somebody else should have one, let me know down below. But unless you make a very compelling argument, I think Lilia will keep his crown. Now then, before you go, I'd just like to remind you that you're amazing and I hope you have a wonderful day.